Millionaire abandons his pregnant fiancée. 3 years later, she ignores him at a charity event. The rhythmic drumming of raindrops against the window pane filled the silence of the small apartment, but Scarlett Hayes barely noticed. She sat on the edge of her bed, an ultrasound resting delicately on her knees, a black and white glimpse of the life that would forever alter her own. Her gaze was vacant, unfocused, as Eleanor Willard's words replayed in her mind, each syllable like a dagger twisting deeper into her chest. "Scarlett, I'm not going to change my whole life because of one mistake." A mistake. That was all it was to him. Not the beginning of a family, not a miracle, just an inconvenience. A flaw in his perfectly curated future. "Ilara is my best chance at saving my business. I'm not going to risk everything for something I never wanted." Even now, the sting of his words lingered, but Scarlett had refused to beg. She knew pleading wouldn't change Eleanor's mind. When he dropped her off in front of her apartment that night, she stepped out of the car in silence, her heart shattered, but her dignity unscathed. For hours, she sat in the dark, clutching the ultrasound to her chest as silent tears traced paths down her cheeks. The emptiness was suffocating. How could she possibly raise a child alone? Doubt loomed over her like a storm cloud, but beneath the fear, something else stirred, a quiet yet unshakable resolve. "I'll do it, with or without him. I'll make it." Eleanor Willard was the embodiment of success, a name that commanded respect, a face that inspired admiration and envy in equal measure. Young, charming, and ruthless, he had everything a man could want. And yet, as he sat in his luxurious office, a crystal tumbler of bourbon in hand, something felt off. It was the right decision, he muttered under his breath, trying to silence the gnawing unease. A necessary sacrifice. But no matter how many times he told himself that, Scarlett's final words before stepping out of his car refused to leave him. "One day, Eleanor, you'll realize that there are things all the money in the world can't fix." He exhaled sharply and shook his head, as if doing so could dislodge her from his thoughts. No, he had made the logical choice. Ilara Chang was the daughter of an influential tycoon, the key to expanding his empire, the insurance policy that would cement his place at the top. There was no room for emotion in his world. The months that followed were some of the most grueling of Scarlett's life. As an emergency doctor in one of Chicago's busiest districts, her days were a relentless cycle of racing between hospitals and ambulances, saving lives while struggling to keep her own from unraveling. Pregnancy only made everything harder. The exhaustion was unrelenting, the ache in her back and legs a constant reminder of the weight she carried, both physical and emotional. But giving up was never an option. One night, after an exhausting 12-hour shift, Scarlett was called to a catastrophic multi-vehicle accident on the interstate. The scene was chaos, flashing lights, wailing sirens, and the desperate cries of the injured filling the night air. Ignoring the pain clawing at her body, she dove into the wreckage, driven by adrenaline and duty. As she crouched beside a man trapped in the twisted remains of a truck, a sharp pain tore through her abdomen. For a fleeting second, fear gripped her. She should call for help. She should stop. But there was no time to think about herself. Gritting her teeth, she pushed through the pain and kept going. It wasn't until the patient was stabilized and safely transferred to the hospital that she realized something was wrong. "Scarlett, are you okay?" a paramedic asked, noticing her ghostly pale complexion. She opened her mouth to answer, but the world around her tilted and blurred. Darkness took over. The steady hum of machines and the sharp scent of disinfectant filled Scarlett's senses as she blinked awake. A nurse's kind smile was the first thing she saw. "Congratulations, Dr. Hayes, you've given birth to a beautiful baby girl." For a moment, Scarlett just stared, her mind struggling to process the words. Her hand drifted instinctively to her abdomen, empty now. Panic surged, sensing her fear. The nurse gestured to the crib beside the bed, and there she was, a tiny, delicate bundle, sleeping peacefully, blissfully, unaware of the turmoil that had brought her into the world. Scarlett's throat tightened as tears welled in her eyes. "Lily," she whispered, reaching out with trembling fingers. "Hi, my little Lily." The first few months as a single mother were an uphill battle. Scarlett returned to work in increments, splitting her time between saving lives on Chicago's unforgiving streets and caring for the tiny life that depended entirely on her. There were nights she barely slept, nights when exhaustion and doubt threatened to consume her, but each morning she found the strength to carry on. Violet was her reason. Meanwhile, Eleanor Willard was waging his own war, one of his own making. His marriage to Alara was a carefully curated illusion, a hollow arrangement built on ambition rather than love. They lived like strangers, bound by a contract rather than connection. And the financial empire he had sacrificed everything for, it was beginning to crumble, piece by piece, under the weight of his own miscalculations. Despite the crumbling economy and the slow unraveling of his once flawless business empire, Eleanor Willard refused to acknowledge his mistakes, both in his financial ventures and in his personal life. Admitting failure was not in his nature, but denial did little to silence the nagging unease that had settled in his chest. One evening, alone in his penthouse high above the city, Eleanor found himself staring at an old photograph, one he had buried at the bottom of a drawer long ago, yet never quite let go of. It was a picture of Scarlett. He traced the edges of the worn photo absent-mindedly, his jaw tightening. He should have tossed it years ago. He should have moved on. And yet, no matter how many times he tried to push her from his thoughts, she always found a way back. Because deep down, some part of him knew the truth. The night he walked away from Scarlett was not just the night he lost her. It was the beginning of his downfall. 3 years had passed since Scarlett Hayes had been left to rebuild her life from the ashes. And she had done exactly that. Her reputation as a doctor had flourished, not only because of her exceptional medical skill, but because of the unwavering empathy and leadership that defined her. In one of Chicago's most overburdened hospitals, she was the glue that held teams together, the steady presence in the chaos, the quiet force that gave hope to those in the darkest moments of their lives. The work was exhausting, relentless, but Scarlett never saw it as a burden. Every patient she treated, every life she saved, was a testament to how far she had come. And as the years passed, her dedication reached beyond the hospital walls. She spearheaded community health initiatives, organizing free medical clinics in underprivileged neighborhoods, raising funds for new healthcare facilities, and advocating for better resources for those who had nowhere else to turn. Her relentless drive and the impact of her work made headlines. Chicago's hero, Dr. She, never saw herself that way. She wasn't chasing fame, she was chasing purpose, because she was no longer the woman who had once sat in the dark, crying over a love that had abandoned her. She was stronger now. And she had one unwavering mission, to give Violet the life she deserved. Then, the invitation arrived. Dr. Scarlett Hayes is invited to be honored at the Chang Group's annual charity event. Scarlett stared at the email, her fingers hovering over the keyboard, her heart beat a fraction too fast. The Chang Group was one of the most influential conglomerates in the country, widely recognized for its philanthropic initiatives, yet tainted by corporate scandals that surfaced every few years. An invitation like this was an opportunity, one that could elevate her initiatives to new heights. And yet, unease lingered. Something about it felt off. But when she thought about Lily, about the future she wanted to build, Scarlett straightened her shoulders and made her decision. She would go, because this wasn't just another charity gala. It was a statement. A chance to show the world, and herself, just how far she had come. Across the city, in the opulent bedroom of his penthouse, Eleanor Willard adjusted the silk knot of his tie, his reflection staring back at him from the gilded mirror. The night ahead was just another event in his carefully curated world. Or so he thought. Despite the crushing weight of failure on his shoulders, Eleanor knew he had no choice but to attend the charity event Alara had insisted, her tone clipped and businesslike, emphasizing that his presence was crucial for maintaining the Chang family's pristine public image. He felt like nothing more than a chess piece, maneuvered to serve the ambitions of others. But tonight, something in him was restless. It was time to go. The grand ballroom of Chicago's most opulent hotel was a masterpiece of refinement. Crystal chandeliers bathed the room in a golden glow, casting soft light over the glittering elite. Murmurs of polished conversations, laughter masked in propriety, and the clinking of champagne glasses filled the air. Powerful names wrapped in designer fabrics and flawless facades moved like pieces on an invisible board. And then she arrived. Scarlett, she walked into the room with effortless grace, accompanied by a hospital assistant who carried the weight of a small, precious bundle. Lily, her dress, a deep sapphire blue, skimmed her figure with understated elegance, commanding attention without trying. But it wasn't the gown that drew eyes to her. It was her. There was something about Scarlett that radiated strength, an unshakable calm forged through fire. She didn't demand the room's attention. It was given to her, effortlessly, as though the very air shifted in her presence. At the back of the hall, Eleanor stood with a glass of bourbon, barely engaged in the monotonous exchanges around him. His mind was elsewhere, lost in the tedium of another evening spent playing a role he had long since grown weary of. Then he saw movement near the entrance. His gaze flicked in that direction. And everything else ceased to exist, Scarlett thought. For a brief, disorienting moment, Eleanor thought his mind was playing tricks on him. She had changed. The softness of youth had been replaced with something refined, something unyielding. But she was still her. His eyes traced every detail, the elegant lines of her dress, the gentle yet distant smile she offered to those around her, until his gaze landed on the small figure in her arms, a little girl, with light brown curls and striking blue eyes. Eleanor's grip tightened around his glass, his pulse pounding in his ears. The room, the noise, the gala, it all faded into nothing. Scarlett felt his stare before she ever turned to meet it, and when their eyes finally locked across the crowded room, something raw and undeniable ignited in the space between them. An invisible current, charged with unspoken words and unfinished history, crackled through the air. And in that moment, everything changed. Eleanor took a step forward, then stopped. Scarlett's expression froze him in place. She looked at him, not with shock, not with anger, but with an unsettling calm, as if she had expected this moment, had prepared for it. Lily, nestled in her mother's arms, murmured softly to herself, absorbed in the tiny toy she held. She had no idea of the storm brewing in the space between the two adults. Scarlett lifted her chin slightly, her unwavering gaze locking onto his, and for a brief second, something flickered at the corner of her lips. Not quite a smile, but something close. And then, neither of them moved, neither of them spoke. They just stood there, locked in a silent battle of unspoken words, the years stretching between them like a vast, unbridgeable chasm. The noise of the gala faded into the background. The clinking glasses, the polite laughter, the murmur of social pleasantries. It all became irrelevant. Because in that moment, the silence between them was deafening, a prelude to the reckoning that was about to change everything. Eleanor stood rooted to the spot, watching as Scarlett's name was called. The room erupted in applause as she gracefully stepped onto the stage, her presence commanding the attention of everyone in attendance. She accepted the award with a poised smile, her eyes bright, not with tears but with an inner light, a quiet power that radiated from within. And when she finally spoke, her voice was strong, steady, carrying the weight of everything she had endured. "I dedicate this award to my daughter Lily, who gave me the strength to carry on, even when everything seemed impossible." Eleanor barely registered the applause that followed. His heart pounded against his ribs as he watched her, as he absorbed the magnitude of what he had walked away from. And then, summoning every ounce of courage he had, he moved toward her. He had to speak to her. He had to say something. But when he finally reached her, Scarlett turned to him with an unreadable expression, cool, composed, detached, a stranger's gaze. And without a single word, without a flicker of hesitation, she walked past him, ignored him, as if he were nothing more than another nameless face in the crowd. Eleanor remained frozen, his body numb, as he watched her disappear into the sea of people. She had ignored him, completely. The weight of his untouched bourbon glass felt suddenly unbearable in his grip. But it wasn't the drink that burned. It wasn't the crowd that suffocated him. It was the image etched into his mind, impossible to erase, of Scarlett holding that little girl. His little girl. The woman on that stage was not the same Scarlett he had once known. Gone was the young, hopeful woman who had loved him so fiercely. In her place stood someone untouchable, confident, radiant, unshakable. And she had walked away without so much as a glance. Eleanor exhaled sharply, jaw tightening. He had expected many things tonight, but he hadn't expected this. And it was eating him alive. The look Scarlett gave him, calm, composed, and utterly indifferent, was like a blade slicing through his soul. It wasn't anger, it wasn't even resentment, it was nothingness. She looked at him the way one looks at a stranger, as if he were a face lost in the crowd, a passing moment of no significance. And somehow that cut deeper than hatred ever could. Eleanor wasn't sure what unsettled him more, the undeniable truth that she had moved on, or the even harsher reality that she had done so without needing him. And then there was the child. The daughter he had turned his back on, the one he had abandoned before she had even drawn her first breath. Eleanor inhaled sharply, forcing himself to stay composed, but the weight of realization pressed down on him with suffocating force. The tightness in his chest, the whirlwind of emotions churning inside him, it was all so consuming that he failed to mask it. And Elara noticed, his wife, impeccably put together in a shimmering red gown, glided toward him, her champagne flute delicately balanced between manicured fingers, her expression a mixture of irritation and curiosity. "Eleanor, you've been acting strange all evening," she said, arching a perfectly sculpted brow. He averted his gaze. Too late. Elara caught the flicker of unease in his expression, and her sharp instincts latched onto it. She studied him for a lingering moment, weighing whether to press the issue now or bide her time for a more opportune moment. Then, with a theatrical sigh, she gave a small, dismissive shrug. "Fine, get your coat. I've had enough of this evening too, let's go home." The mansion was cold, not in temperature but in essence. Every gleaming surface, every meticulously chosen decoration, every symbol of wealth and power. None of it seemed to matter anymore. As soon as Eleanor stepped inside, he loosened his tie and strode straight to his study, closing the door behind him with more force than necessary. The silence was deafening, Scarlet Lily. The two of them etched into his mind like an inescapable ghost, replaying in an endless loop. He saw Scarlett standing on that stage, dignified and radiant, her lips curving into a soft, knowing smile as she accepted her award. He saw the little girl in her arms, eyes full of innocent wonder, clutching a tiny toy without a care in the world. And then he saw that look again, cold, detached, final. It hit him harder than he was willing to admit. She's really moved on, the thought burned in his chest, thick and suffocating. But it wasn't just that. She didn't just move on, she despised him, and for the first time in his life, Eleanor Willard felt something unfamiliar clawing at his insides, something that even power, success, and all the money in the world couldn't fix. Regret. And it was already too late, and rightly so. Eleanor deserved every ounce of it. He tried to push the thoughts away, to drown them out with logic, but they came crashing back with relentless force. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to feel the full depth of his mistake. He had chosen ambition over love. He had traded Scarlett, the family he never even gave a chance, for what he believed was the safer path, the logical choice. And now everything felt hollow. The power, the wealth, the meticulously crafted life he had built, it all felt like an illusion, a gilded prison with no meaning. The sudden creak of the office door pulled him from his thoughts. Eleanor looked up. Elara stood in the doorway, still dressed in her elegant red gown, her posture rigid, her expression unreadable. But something in her eyes had changed, and instinctively Eleanor knew that whatever she was about to say wasn't good. "We need to talk," she said, her voice firm. Eleanor frowned, straightening in his chair, but he nodded, gesturing for her to come in. Elara stepped inside and closed the door behind her. Then, crossing her arms over her chest, she fixed him with a look that was neither angry nor resentful, just final. "I'll get straight to the point," she began. "Our marriage is over." The words struck harder than Eleanor had anticipated. He blinked, momentarily stunned. His mouth parted to respond, but before he could say a word, Elara lifted a hand. "Before you try to argue, let me explain." Her tone was calm, almost impatient, as though this was something he should have seen coming. "I met someone." Eleanor's stomach dropped. "And frankly, I think you should have realized a long time ago that this was bound to happen." A sharp, humorless laugh escaped Isabel's lips as she shook her head. "Eleanor, spare me the drama," she cut him off before he could protest. Our marriage was always a transaction, and we both know it. We played our roles, we kept up appearances, but I'm done pretending. I want something real." Eleanor swallowed hard, struggling to process the sudden shift, the inevitability of it all. "Are you saying you want a divorce?" "Yes," she answered without hesitation. "And there's no point in trying to convince me otherwise. My mind is made up." She exhaled, the weight of the conversation lifting from her shoulders. Then after a brief pause, she added, "I'm moving into Peter's apartment." Eleanor barely reacted. Not because he didn't care, but because for the first time he realized something chilling. This wasn't the loss that mattered. This wasn't the heartbreak that haunted him. Because Ilara was right. Their marriage had never been real. But Scarlett was, and now just like Isabel, she had moved on. The only difference was Scarlett had never looked back. Peter, of course. Eleanor barely had time to process the name. It didn't matter. None of it did. What mattered was what this separation meant. Without Isabel, he would lose the support of the Chang Group, and without their money, his company, the empire he had built, would collapse. Panic flickered beneath the surface, but he forced himself to keep his voice steady. "Isabel, do you have any idea what this means for me?" he asked, gripping the edge of his desk, his knuckles white. She tilted her head, unimpressed. "That's not my problem, Eleanor," she said, her tone cool, detached. "You made your choices. Now I'm making mine." And just like that, she turned and walked away. She didn't slam the door, she didn't look back, she simply left, leaving Eleanor alone in the office, drowning in the silence she had left behind. The night stretched on, endless and unforgiving. Eleanor sat in his leather armchair for hours, staring blankly into the dimly lit room. It felt as though the ground beneath him was disintegrating, everything he had built collapsing, piece by piece. First Scarlett, then Lily, now Isabel. It was as if the universe was stripping him of everything, leaving him with nothing but the wreckage of his own decisions. But in the midst of it all, through the suffocating weight of his failures, one thought tormented him more than anything else. It wasn't Isabel. It wasn't the Chang Group, it was Scarlett, the woman he had once loved, the woman he had abandoned, the woman who had rebuilt herself without him. He had lost the chance to be a father. He had lost the family he never truly realized he wanted until it was too late. And now, she was gone. Untouchable, unreachable. Eleanor exhaled sharply, his chest tightening with something he hadn't felt in years. Regret. True, aching, unbearable regret. Outside, the city of Chicago pulsed with life, indifferent to the storm raging inside him. But Eleanor had made up his mind. He wouldn't sit here and drown in his mistakes. He would go after Scarlett, and this time, he wouldn't let her slip away. Scarlett stepped into her apartment, weary from the long night but unable to relax. The tribute had been a success. People had congratulated her, shaken her hand, spoken of her strength and resilience. And yet, the only thing looping through her mind was him. Little Violet was fast asleep in the next room, curled up with her favorite teddy bear, blissfully unaware of the storm raging inside her mother's heart. Scarlett sighed and sank onto the sofa, kicking off her heels with little care as she leaned back and closed her eyes. The apartment was silent, too silent, and in that silence memories crept in like unwelcome ghosts, flooding back with startling clarity. Eleanor? She had seen him again after 3 long years. Their eyes had met across the crowded ballroom and, for a moment, the world had fallen away. The shock in his expression, the disbelief, the way he had looked at her as if he had seen a ghost, one he never expected to haunt him again. Scarlett clenched her jaw, hating the way that brief exchange had affected her. Hating the way it had stirred up emotions she thought she had buried. Once, upon a time, she had loved Eleanor Willard with all her heart. She had believed in him, trusted in the idea that he would be her safe haven forever. But love had not saved her. Love had not stopped him from walking away. And now, after all these years, after all the strength she had built from the wreckage he left behind, seeing him again felt like standing at the edge of a past she had fought to escape. Anger, sadness, and something else. Something she refused to acknowledge. A flicker of longing. "It doesn't matter anymore," she muttered to herself, wrapping her arms around her body, trying to ward off the cold creeping in, not from the room, but from within. The Eleanor I loved is in the past, and the past had no place in her life anymore. With that, she pushed herself off the couch and headed to her bedroom. Violet was her only priority. It was for her daughter that she fought every single day, and it was for her that she would keep moving forward, no matter what ghosts tried to resurface. The next morning, Chicago's sun rose hesitantly, breaking through the thick clouds in streaks of muted gold. But inside the hospital where Scarlett worked, the day had already begun. Bustling, urgent, and relentless. And that was exactly what she needed. Something to keep her mind occupied. Something to keep her heart from remembering. As soon as Scarlett stepped through the hospital doors, a wave of cheers and applause greeted her. "Our heroine is back," one of the nurses teased, prompting laughter from the group. Scarlett couldn't help but smile. Despite everything, despite the exhaustion, despite the emotional turmoil still lingering from the night before, this place felt like home. Her colleagues, her patients, the chaotic rhythm of the emergency room, this was where she belonged. After exchanging warm words and thanks, a call over the intercom interrupted the moment. "Dr. Hayes, please report to Dr. Reynolds' office," the hospital director. A flicker of curiosity passed through her as she made her way down the corridor. Dr. Julian Reynolds was a man of presence, tall, silver-haired, with an imposing posture that could intimidate those who didn't know him well. But Scarlett had worked under him long enough to recognize the kindness in his eyes and the deep respect he held for his staff. As she stepped into his office, he greeted her with a knowing smile. "Congratulations, Scarlett," he said, gesturing toward the chair in front of his desk. "You deserve every bit of recognition you received last night." "Thank you, Dr. Reynolds. That means a lot," she replied sincerely, taking a seat. He leaned forward, crossing his arms over his desk. There was something in his expression, an intensity that told her this wasn't just a casual conversation. "Actually, I called you here because I want to talk to you about an opportunity." Scarlett frowned slightly. "An opportunity?" Julian nodded. "Yes. Your reputation isn't just growing within this hospital, Scarlett, it's growing throughout the state. And as it happens, I was recently contacted by a hospital in Seattle." Scarlett S.'s eyebrows lifted in surprise. "Seattle?" "They're searching for a new director to lead their emergency unit," he continued, "and your name was the first one I suggested." For a moment, Scarlett was speechless. "Director?" she echoed, the weight of the word settling over her. "That's right," Julian confirmed, a small smile tugging at his lips. "It's a rare opportunity. They're making major investments in infrastructure, cutting-edge technology, everything you could want in an ER department. And the best part? You'd have full control over implementing your own methods. No red tape, no outdated systems holding you back." Scarlett's heart pounded. This was huge, not just for her career but for Lily. A new life, a fresh start, financial security, stability, and yet, the thought of leaving Chicago, of uprooting everything she had built, sent a rush of uncertainty through her. I don't know what to say," she admitted, her mind racing. Julian chuckled. "Yes, you do," he said knowingly. "I've watched you long enough to know you never back down from a challenge. This isn't just another job, Scarlett. It's the next chapter in your journey." Scarlett exhaled slowly, her fingers resting lightly on the desk as she absorbed his words. Seattle, a new beginning. But was she ready to take it? Scarlett sat in quiet reflection, staring out the window of her Chicago apartment. What was really keeping her here? Apart from work and a handful of close friends, she had no deep roots in this city. Nothing tying her down. Violet was still young. She'd be starting school next year. But a move now wouldn't disrupt her life too much. And more than anything, this was an opportunity to build something, even better, for both of them. Scarlett exhaled slowly, the weight of her decision settling over her. Then, lifting her gaze to meet Dr. Reynolds' expectant expression, she gave a firm nod. "All right, I accept." Julian's face lit up with approval. "Excellent choice," he said. "I'll handle the paperwork with the hospital in Seattle. They want you to start as soon as possible, so I suggest you begin preparing for the move immediately." Scarlett nodded, already feeling the rush of anticipation and uncertainty intertwining in her chest. Seattle. A fresh start. The next day, Scarlett wasted no time. She dove into the move with the same efficiency she applied to her work. There was little room for hesitation, only action. Boxes piled up quickly, each one filled with memories of a life she was ready to leave behind. Lily, too young to fully grasp the significance of the change, helped in her own way, placing her stuffed animals in a suitcase, giggling as she tried to pack herself inside a box. By late afternoon, their suitcases were zipped, their bags loaded, and just like that, they were on their way to Seattle. The moment Scarlett stepped off the plane, she felt it, the quiet, undeniable weight of change. Seattle was different from Chicago. The air was crisp, the city alive with a different kind of energy. It felt unfamiliar yet brimming with possibility, and as she arrived at the hospital where she would begin this new chapter, her first impression filled her with cautious optimism. The towering building gleamed under the overcast sky, a symbol of progress and innovation. The moment she walked through its doors, she was met with warmth. "Welcome to Seattle, Dr. Hayes," an administrator greeted her, shaking her hand enthusiastically. Scarlett took a steady breath, glancing around at the bustling environment, the new faces, the endless possibilities stretching before her. This was it. The place where she and Violet would build their future, but while Scarlett was stepping into her next chapter, Eleanor Willard was chasing the past. For 2 days, he had done nothing but obsess over one thing, finding her. After asking discreet questions at the charity event, pulling the right strings and following the right leads, he finally had his answer. And now he was here, sitting in his car, parked across from the hospital where she worked. His hands clenched the steering wheel, slick with sweat. His pulse pounded in his ears, his stomach twisted in knots. This was it. Eleanor Willard, who had once walked away without looking back, was now the man who couldn't stay away. A man consumed by regret, and for the first time in years he was terrified. Because this time he had no idea if Scarlett Hayes would even be willing to hear him out. He had to see her. He had to say what he had never had the courage to say. Eleanor exhaled sharply, forcing down the knot of anxiety in his chest. Then, without another moment of hesitation, he stepped out of his car and strode into the hospital, determined to find her. But the moment he reached the reception desk, something felt wrong. "Good afternoon, sir. How can I help you?" the receptionist asked with a professional smile. "I'm looking for Dr. Scarlett Hayes," he said, his voice firmer than he felt. The receptionist's expression didn't change. "Ah, Dr. Hayes. Unfortunately, she no longer works here." Eleanor blinked. "What?" The words didn't make sense. No. She moved to Seattle, took up a new position there." "Seattle?" The word struck him like a thunderclap, echoing in his mind as if the universe was mocking him. "Thank you," he mumbled, barely hearing his own voice as he turned away from the desk. By the time he stepped back into the crisp Chicago air, his pulse was pounding. For the second time in his life, Scarlett had slipped through his fingers. He had made his decision. He was going to make things right. But now, fate had thrown yet another obstacle in his path. Still, Eleanor Willard had never been the kind of man to back down from a challenge. "Seattle," he muttered as he slid into the driver's seat, gripping the wheel. "If that's where she is, then that's where I'm going." Eleanor Willard wasted no time. The moment he pulled out of the hospital parking lot, he was already making plans. Flights, accommodations, logistics. But what he wasn't prepared for, what no amount of planning could solve, was what the hell he was going to say when he found her. Apologies. Explanations? Would any of it even matter? The truth was, he had no idea how Scarlett would react to seeing him again. But he did know one thing. He couldn't keep living like this, with the weight of regret pressing down on him, with the knowledge that he had destroyed something precious, and never even tried to make it right. At first, he told himself that this trip was just to clear the air, to make amends, to close the door on the past. But deep down, he knew the truth. He wanted more. He wanted a second chance, even if he wasn't sure he deserved one. Meanwhile, Scarlett was settling into her new life. Seattle felt like a breath of fresh air, a new beginning, a place untouched by the ghosts of the past. But the past? It had a way of finding you when you least expected it. and it was already on its way. The hospital where Scarlett now worked was everything it had promised to be, a place of progress and precision, where modern facilities met the expertise of a highly skilled team. It challenged her, pushed her to be better, and she thrived in it. But the changes in her life weren't just professional. Her new home, a charming, cozy house nestled in a quiet neighborhood, felt like the fresh start she had been longing for. It was surrounded by towering trees, with parks where Violet loved to run and play, her laughter echoing through the open spaces. For the first time in years, Scarlett felt like she was building something real, something lasting, a life where she and Violet could truly belong. And yet, no matter how deeply she immersed herself in this new routine, there were moments when her mind betrayed her, moments when her thoughts drifted back to Chicago, back to him. She hated admitting it, but seeing Eleanor at the charity event had stirred something in her, something she didn't want to name. It wasn't just the shock of seeing him again after all these years. It was the way he had looked at her, the raw intensity in his gaze, the regret, the disbelief, the silent desperation. Scarlett clenched her jaw and shook her head, forcing herself to push those thoughts aside every time they surfaced. It doesn't matter anymore, she told herself. He doesn't matter anymore. But no matter how often she whispered those words, she knew they weren't entirely true. Because even after all this time, Eleanor Willard's presence still had the power to shake her, and she hated that. Eleanor arrived in Seattle under a gray, overcast sky. A fine drizzle clung to the city, coating the streets in a reflective sheen, mirroring the weight pressing down on him. He exhaled slowly, gripping the wheel tighter as he navigated the unfamiliar roads. This was it. This was his moment to make things right. He had spent days gathering the information he needed. Scarlett's hospital, the neighborhood where she had settled, but knowing where she was and knowing how to face her were two entirely different things. Because the truth was, he had no idea how she would react. Would she hear him out? Would she slam the door in his face? Did he even have the right to ask for forgiveness? A bitter voice in the back of his mind whispered the answer, no. But despite it all, despite the weight of his own mistakes, Eleanor knew one thing for certain. He had to try. At that very moment, Scarlett was deep into her shift at the hospital, completely absorbed in the controlled chaos of the ER. It had been an intense day, one that tested her skill, her resilience, and her ability to stay composed under pressure. And that was exactly what she needed. Because when she was here, saving lives, making decisions that mattered, there was no room to think about the past. No room to think about Eleanor. At least, that was what she told herself. For now, it was exactly the kind of challenge Scarlett thrived on, the kind that pushed her, sharpened her skills, and reminded her why she had chosen this path. But by the end of the day, exhaustion settled into her bones. The relentless pace of the ER, the flood of cases, the adrenaline-fueled decisions, she could handle all of it. What she couldn't handle was the silence that followed. Needing a moment to breathe, she made her way to the hospital cafeteria, wrapping her hands around a cup of coffee as she mentally reviewed the day's cases. That's when a nurse approached. "Dr. Hayes, there's a man at reception asking for you." Scarlett frowned, caught off guard. A man? Did he say his name? The nurse shook her head. No, but he seemed determined. A chill rippled down Scarlett's spine. For a brief, fleeting second, she thought of him. But she quickly dismissed the idea. There was no way Eleanor could have found her. No way he could know she was here. Still, a strange sense of unease settled in her chest. "I'll be right there," she said, forcing her voice to stay steady as she walked toward the reception desk. Her heartbeat quickened. She had no idea who was waiting for her, but the moment she turned the corner, everything inside her froze. Eleanor. He was standing there, hands in his pockets, his posture tense but composed. His gaze swept the room as if searching for something, someone. Then their eyes met, and something shifted. A flicker of recognition, of something raw and unspoken, passed between them. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Eleanor took a step forward, but Scarlett immediately lifted a hand, an invisible barrier between them. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice firm, edged with disbelief. His jaw tightened. "We need to talk, Scarlett." His voice was low, rough, full of urgency. She crossed her arms, standing her ground. "No, we don't," she shot back. "I have nothing to say to you, Eleanor." His expression flickered with something almost desperate. "But I have a lot to say," he countered. "Please, just give me 5 minutes." Scarlett hesitated. Every rational part of her told her to turn around, to shut him out, to refuse to reopen wounds that had barely finished healing. But there was another part of her, a deeper, quieter part. A part that still remembered the way he had looked at her that night. A part that, despite everything, wanted to hear what he had to say. And that was the part that terrified her the most. 5 minutes, Scarlett finally said, her voice cold, controlled. "And only because I don't want you showing up here again." She turned on her heel and led him down a hallway, pushing open the door to an empty staff restroom. The moment they stepped inside, she shut the door behind them, sealing them off from the rest of the world. Eleanor stood there, shifting slightly, looking nervous. Scarlett had never seen him like this before. He had always been so confident, so composed, always the man who had all the answers, who controlled every situation. But now? Now, he looked like a man standing on the edge of a precipice, uncertain of the ground beneath him. The sight of it unsettled her more than she wanted to admit. "Talk," she said, crossing her arms again, reinforcing the distance between them. Eleanor exhaled slowly, as if steadying himself. "I know I made a terrible mistake," he began, his eyes locked onto hers. "Walking away from you and our daughter was the worst decision of my life." Scarlett felt something tighten in her chest. She had braced herself for arrogance, for excuses, but not this. Not the rawness in his voice, not the weight of his regret pressing down on the air between them. "You're years too late, Eleanor," she said, her tone sharp, an armor for the pain buried beneath. "I know," he admitted, taking a step forward. "I know I can't undo what I did, but I want to fix it. I want to be there for Lily. I want to try to be part of her life." Scarlett blinked. She had imagined so many things he might say, but not this. "Do you think you can just show up after 3 years and suddenly claim the right to be a father?" Her voice was rising now, emotions clawing their way to the surface. "I'm not claiming anything, Scarlett," Eleanor said, his voice unsteady, his control cracking. "I'm asking, begging." Silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. Scarlett studied him, searching his face for something, anything, that would tell her if this was real. She saw the guilt, she saw the desperation, and for the first time she saw fear. The fear of losing something he hadn't even realized he wanted. Scarlett's breath was unsteady when she finally spoke. "I need to think." Eleanor opened his mouth as if to say something, anything, but before he could, she turned, pulled the door open, and stepped out. She didn't look back. And Eleanor was left standing there, alone, the weight of his mistakes pressing down heavier than ever. Scarlett spent the rest of the day failing to concentrate. She moved through her shift on autopilot, responding to cases, reviewing charts, giving orders. But no matter how hard she tried to push it aside, the conversation with Eleanor lingered like an unwelcome shadow in the back of her mind. She didn't know what to do. Part of her wanted to believe him, wanted to believe that his regret was real, that he was truly here to make things right. But the other part, the part that had spent sleepless nights wondering how she would ever recover from his betrayal, was terrified. Terrified of opening that door again. Terrified that if she let him in, he would destroy her all over again. Eleanor walked out of the hospital, with the weight of 3 years pressing down on his shoulders, heavier than ever. The conversation had been nothing like what he had hoped for. But what had he expected? Forgiveness? Understanding? A second chance handed to him just because he had finally decided to show up? No, Scarlett was different now, stronger, more secure, and much less willing to let him back in. The look in her eyes had been enough to gut him, pain laced with steel, anger hiding the raw wound he had left behind. She should hate him. He had earned that, and yet he wasn't sure if he could live with the knowledge that she might never let him fix what he had broken. As he drove to his hotel, his mind spun with questions that had no easy answers. He thought he was ready for this fight. ready to prove to Scarlett and to himself that he had changed. But would she even give him the chance? And worse, did he have the strength to face the battle it would take to earn it? Scarlett spent the night staring at the ceiling, unable to quiet her thoughts. After Violet finally drifted into peaceful sleep, she was left alone with the storm in her mind. Eleanor's visit crashed over her like a tidal wave, relentless and overwhelming. What did he think he was doing, turning up after everything that had happened? She pressed a pillow against her face, muffling the frustrated groan that escaped her lips. Why? Why now? Why couldn't he just stay buried in the past where he belonged? When the sun finally broke over the horizon, Scarlett pushed herself out of bed with a mix of exhaustion and resolve. She was done. Done letting Eleanor Willard invade her thoughts. Done letting his sudden reappearance stir emotions she had fought so hard to bury. Whatever regrets he carried now didn't erase what he had done. Or rather, what he hadn't done. He had abandoned her. When she had needed him most, he had turned his back on her, choosing convenience over commitment, and now he was here, acting as if words could fix what years of silence had shattered, but Scarlett knew better. Words were easy. Actions were what mattered, and Eleanor Willard had never been a man of action when it counted. By late afternoon, Eleanor was back at the hospital. He had spent hours rehearsing his words, running over every possible way this conversation could go. None of it made a difference. When he arrived, the receptionist informed him that Scarlett was finishing a procedure and would be available soon. So he waited, and every second felt like an eternity. Finally, she appeared, still in her emergency uniform, exhaustion etched into her features. But the moment her eyes landed on him, her spine straightened and her arms folded across her chest. "You again," she said, exhaling sharply. "I thought I made myself clear yesterday." Eleanor stood, trying to steady himself. "Scarlett, I know you're angry." "Angry?" she cut in, a humorless laugh escaping her lips. "That's an understatement." Eleanor swallowed, forcing himself to stay calm. "I deserve that, but please, let me explain." "Explain what, Eleanor?" Scarlett's voice was sharp, unwavering. "That you suddenly realized you had a daughter? That you came here only because your marriage to the Chang Group's heiress fell apart?" Eleanor flinched. It wasn't just the words. It was how effortlessly she had hit the sore spot, like she had known exactly where to strike. "That's not it," he started, shaking his head, but Scarlett held up a hand, silencing him before he could continue. "Isn't it?" she challenged, her voice rising now. "Then tell me, why did it take you 3 years to come to me, Eleanor?" Eleanor opened his mouth to answer, but she didn't give him the chance. "Where were you when I was pregnant and terrified? When I was working 2 jobs just to make sure our daughter had a future? When I was alone in a hospital bed bringing our child into the world?" Her voice cracked slightly, but she powered through, fire burning in her eyes. "You didn't care then," Scarlett said. "No." Her voice was firm, final. "Now you listen." The weight of her words, of years of pain compressed into a single moment, fell between them like a hammer. And Eleanor, for the first time in his life, he had nothing to say. Scarlett's voice shook with the force of emotions she had held back for years. "You abandoned me because I wasn't the right choice. Because I couldn't offer you stability. Because I didn't fit into the perfect future you had planned for yourself." She took a breath, but it did nothing to steady her. "And now, after everything has fallen apart, after the life you chose turned to dust, you show up here expecting what, Eleanor? That I'll just take you back?" Eleanor opened his mouth to speak, but she stepped forward before he could. "No," she said, her voice burning with conviction. "You don't get to talk over me. Not this time." Her eyes, blazing with fury and something deeper, something broken, held him in place. "You think you can show up after 3 years, say you're sorry, and expect to be part of Lily's life? That's not how it works. I am not your safety option, Eleanor." Her words cut him like a blade, and he felt every syllable as if they were wounds he had inflicted on himself. Because she was right, about everything. "Scarlett, I didn't come here because I lost everything," he said, his voice thick with something close to desperation. "I came because I realized how wrong I was. I came because I want to be there for Lily." Scarlett let out a breathless laugh, one that held no humor, only exhaustion. "And you think I'm just going to trust that?" she shot back. Words are easy, Eleanor, you of all people should know that. And honestly, her gaze hardened. I don't trust you. Silence stretched between them, heavy and suffocating. Then, after a deep breath, her voice dropped to something quieter. Controlled. If you really want to be in Lily's life, you're going to have to prove it, and not to me, to her. Because I won't allow you to come and go as you please. Violet is the most precious thing I have, and I will not let her get hurt. Eleanor swallowed hard and nodded, the weight of her words sinking in. She wasn't asking him to fight for her, she was daring him to prove that he could, that he would. I understand, he said finally, his voice low but firm. Scarlett's gaze narrowed. Do you? She asked, her tone laced with doubt. Because I don't think you realize what you're asking for. She paused, her expression unreadable. But here's what I'm going to say. If you really want to be in Lily's life, show it. Not with empty promises, not with grand gestures, with actions. She turned, already reaching for the door, but then she stopped, glanced back at him over her shoulder, and delivered the final blow. And one more thing, Eleanor. Don't do this for me. Don't come here thinking you can fix what we had. Her voice dropped to something almost gentle. Because that's already dead and buried. And then she was gone. Leaving him alone, again Eleanor stood frozen, staring at the empty space where she had just been. Her words replayed in his mind, over and over, sinking deeper with every echo. This wasn't about apologies. This wasn't about fixing the past. This was about proving that he deserved even the smallest place in his daughter's life. And for the first time in years, Eleanor Willard realized this was a battle he couldn't win with charm, with money, with words. This was a battle he would have to earn. And he had no idea if he could. He couldn't blame her. Every word Scarlett had said was true. He had abandoned her. He had made selfish, cowardly choices. And now, he was paying the price. But as he stood there, staring at the empty space where she had just been, a different question haunted him. Did he really want this? Not just the idea of being in Lily's life, but the reality of it? Because this wasn't something he could treat like a business deal. It wasn't something he could walk into half-heartedly only to leave when things got too complicated. It was fatherhood. It was commitment. And the weight of that responsibility was heavier than anything he had ever carried. He thought of the little girl in Scarlett's arms, the soft brown curls, the innocence in her face, the unmistakable reflection of his blue eyes staring back at him. Something about that moment had hit him in a way he hadn't expected, like a force pulling him in, like a connection he hadn't even realized was possible. He wanted to know her. But wanting and deserving were two very different things, and he knew this wouldn't be easy. Eleanor walked through the hospital parking lot, feeling the weight of his decision pressing down on him like an anchor. He could leave. Forget all of this. Pretend he had never come. Start over somewhere else, in a city where no one knew his past, where he didn't have to face what he had lost. Or he could stay and fight, stay and prove that he was more than the man who had once walked away. He slid into the driver's seat, started the engine, but didn't move. His fingers gripped the steering wheel as a single question echoed in his mind. Will I be able to do this? For the first time in his life, Eleanor Willard felt fear. Not the fear of failure, not the fear of losing money, power, or reputation, but the fear of trying, really trying, and still not being enough. And right now, he was trapped in that limbo. The hours blurred together as Eleanor drove aimlessly through the streets of Seattle. He had come here expecting clarity, expecting a sense of purpose. Instead, he felt more lost than ever. His return to Scarlett had unraveled him, and his life in Chicago? That was falling apart too. The divorce with Ilara had sealed his fate. The chain group had pulled their support, cutting off the funding and connections that had kept his business afloat. One by one, important contracts had been canceled. His empire, the one he had chosen over Scarlett, was crumbling. And now, as he sat in his car, watching the rain streak down the windshield, he couldn't help but wonder, had he lost everything because of his own mistakes? Or had he never truly had anything at all? Rumors about Eleanor Willard's crumbling empire were already circulating through business circles. He knew it was only a matter of time before the inevitable happened. Investors were pulling away, contracts were being severed. The once unshakable foundation of his company was cracking under the weight of his own miscalculations. Logic told him to return to Chicago, to salvage what little remained before it was too late. But every time he thought about leaving, something held him back. Or rather, someone. Eleanor began watching Scarlett's life from a distance, not because he wanted to intrude, not because he wanted to make things harder for her. He told himself it was only so he could understand what he had lost. But the truth? The truth was that every glimpse of her life now, without him, was a constant, inescapable reminder of his failure. Scarlett had built something real, something stable. And that's when he noticed she wasn't alone. That morning, Eleanor was standing in a cafe near the hospital, as he had done more times than he cared to admit, when he saw her. Scarlett stepped out of the hospital doors, her face bright with a smile so effortless it sent a sharp pang through his chest. She looked happy, radiant. But that wasn't what made him freeze. She wasn't alone. A man walked beside her. Eleanor recognized him instantly. One of the doctors from the hospital. Tall, brown hair. The kind of man who had an easy, natural charisma. The kind of man people instinctively trusted. And Scarlett, she was laughing with him. It was the kind of laughter Eleanor hadn't seen from her in a long time. The kind that was light, unburdened. The kind that stung more than he was prepared for. He sat there, motionless, his fingers tightening around the coffee cup in his hand. For the first time since coming to Seattle, he truly felt what it meant to have lost her. Over the next few days, Eleanor kept seeing them together. He told himself he wasn't watching them, but that was a lie. It was impossible to not notice. He saw them leaving the hospital together. He saw them walking side by side, talking over coffee. He saw the way Scarlett's expression softened when the doctor spoke, the way she smiled, as if, for once, her past didn't haunt her. And then, one evening, as Eleanor lingered near the hospital parking lot, he saw something that shattered him completely. The doctor was with Lily. Scarlett had finished her shift late, and the man had taken the little girl to buy ice cream while they waited. Violet was beaming, laughing as she held his hand, her small fingers wrapped around his with a trust that made Eleanor's stomach twist. It wasn't just an occasional friendship. It was routine. It was normal. And in that moment, Eleanor understood something with brutal clarity. He hadn't just lost Scarlett. He had lost the family he never even had the courage to build. And now, someone else was stepping into the space he had abandoned. And worst of all, Scarlett and Violet seemed happier for it, to be by Lily's side as she grew up, to be the man Scarlett could look up to. For years, Eleanor Willard had believed that money and status were the cornerstones of a successful life, that wealth equaled security, that power equaled control. But now, standing at the edge of everything he had lost, he saw how wrong he had been. Everything he had once prioritized, his empire, his reputation, was slipping through his fingers. Scarlett had built something real, something irreplaceable. And none of it had anything to do with power or money. That night, Eleanor returned to his hotel room, his mind heavier than ever. There was only one conclusion left to face. He couldn't stay in Seattle. Staying would only prolong his pain, would make it harder for Scarlett and Violet to continue the life they had built without him. I have no place in their lives, he thought, the realization carving into him like a knife. But before he left, he needed to do something. He needed to say something, because he knew, deep down, that he would never have the chance to say everything he felt in person. So, he did the only thing he could. He wrote. Eleanor sat at the small hotel desk, a pen in his hand, staring at the blank sheet of paper before him. The words refused to come. Because how could he possibly explain everything? How could he put into words the regret, the pain, the longing, the love he hadn't been brave enough to admit until it was far too late? But little by little, the ink began to stain the page. At first, the words felt inadequate, slipping away as fast as he could write them. But then, the truth poured out. His hand trembled as he wrote, his chest tightening with every sentence, his vision blurring as emotions bled onto the paper. When he finally finished, Eleanor folded the letter carefully, sealing it inside an envelope. On the front he wrote one name: Scarlett. The next morning, Eleanor walked into the hospital one last time. He didn't try to see her, didn't wait for a chance encounter. He simply approached the front desk, handed the envelope to the receptionist, and said quietly, "Please make sure Dr. Hayes gets this, personally." The receptionist nodded, taking the letter without question. And just like that, it was done. As Eleanor stepped outside into the cool Seattle air, he felt a strange mixture of relief and pain. Relief, because he had finally said what had been buried inside him for years. Pain, because none of it changed the fact that he was walking away, leaving Seattle behind. Leaving her behind. It was the right thing to do, even if each step away felt heavier than the last. Even if every mile between them felt like one more reminder of what he had lost and what he would never get back. The rain in Seattle fell in relentless sheets, pounding against the pavement with an intensity that mirrored the storm raging inside Eleanor Willard. He stood under the awning of his modest hotel, his hands buried in the pockets of his coat, waiting for the cab that would take him to the airport. The downpour was relentless, drenching the city in cold, silver streaks. Water pooled in the cracks of the street, forming puddles that splashed as passing cars cut through them. Eleanor pulled his jacket tighter, but it did little to chase away the chill. Because the cold wasn't from the weather. It was inside him, deep, unshakable. As he watched the rain blur the city's skyline, his mind spiraled through the wreckage of his life. The company he had spent years building was on the edge of collapse. Investors were pulling out, crowds were disappearing overnight. The money, the wealth he had once used to measure his success, was vanishing faster than he could control. Eleanor pulled out his phone, hoping for some kind of lifeline, some kind of news that might suggest his world wasn't crumbling completely. But what he found instead hit him like a fist to the gut. A headline, bold and unforgiving, flashed across his screen. Ilara Chang leads business conglomerate with national projection. New ventures solidify her place at the top of the market. Eleanor stared at the words, his grip tightening around the phone. For long seconds he just stood there, frozen, the rain hammering against the awning above him. Isabel, the woman he had married for security, the woman he had built his future around. Now, she was thriving. While he was falling. His mind replayed the last words she had said to him before walking away. "You made your choices, Eleanor." At the time, he had dismissed them, ignored the weight they carried. Now he understood every decision he had made, prioritizing power, choosing ambition over love, walking away from the only person who had ever truly seen him. It had all led him here, to this moment, to this downfall. And then, there was Scarlett. His chest tightened. Had she read his letter by now? Had she tossed it aside unread? Would she believe a single word he had written? Or had he already destroyed any chance of ever knowing the daughter he had never been brave enough to claim? The uncertainty was suffocating. He had meant every word in that letter, but words were fragile things. They could be torn apart, ignored. And the truth was, that letter wasn't for closure. It was a plea. A final attempt at redemption from a man who had spent too long running from the consequences of his own choices. And now all he could do was wait for a taxi, wait for a flight back to Chicago, wait for a fate he had no control over anymore. And hope that somewhere, somehow, Scarlett might still believe there was something in him worth saving. The cab pulled up at the curb, its tires splashing through the rain-soaked pavement. Eleanor slid into the back seat, the door shutting with a dull thud behind him. Outside, the storm raged on. The rhythmic pounding of the rain against the car roof drowned out the heavy silence inside the vehicle. Eleanor leaned against the window, watching as the city blurred past, the streetlights casting ghostly reflections on the wet pavement. His thoughts were restless, spinning in chaotic circles as he tried to grasp what the future held for him in Chicago. Would there even be a future? Would he rebuild? Or would he simply fade into the ruins of the life he had destroyed? But then, it all happened too fast. A flash of headlights, a dark shape cutting through the intersection, skidding wildly on the slick asphalt. Eleanor barely had time to register the oncoming car before the impact hit. A deafening crash, metal twisting, glass exploding. His world turned upside down, the force of the collision sending his body slamming into the side of the car pane. Blinding, unrelenting. The cab spun, tires screeching, the impact ricocheting through his bones. Eleanor gasped, trying to hold on to consciousness, but the darkness was pulling him under. The last thing he saw, the last thing he felt, was the rain slipping through the shattered windows, cold against his skin. Then, nothing. The hospital was a battlefield. The storm had turned the city into chaos, and the emergency room was drowning in the aftermath. Skidding cars, fallen power lines, people pouring in with injuries, one after another. Scarlett had barely caught a moment to breathe when her radio crackled. "Dr. Hayes, we have a critical patient incoming. Serious car accident, multiple trauma, critical condition." She grabbed her coat without hesitation, instincts taking over. "Prepare the trauma bay, I'll be there." Her mind was already racing through possible injuries, treatment options, what needed to be done to stabilize the patient. She stepped into the ER, her heart hammering from the sheer intensity of the night, and waited as the ambulance doors burst open. The paramedics rushed in, wheeling the stretcher toward them. Scarlett snapped into action, her gaze scanning the patient, already assessing his injuries. And then, her breath caught, her entire world tilted. The man lying on the stretcher, battered, bloodied, barely clinging to consciousness, was Eleanor. For a moment, Scarlett stood frozen. Everything, the noise, the shouting, the storm raging outside, disappeared. The man who had broken her, the man who had abandoned her, the man who had walked away from their daughter, and now he was here, on the brink of death, and it was her hands that held his life in the balance. Her heart twisted violently in her chest, a war raging between every part of her that wanted to turn away, let him feel the pain he had inflicted on her, and the part of her that was a doctor first. A doctor didn't hesitate. A doctor didn't choose their patients. A doctor saved lives. Even if it was the life of a man who had once left her in pieces, Scarlett sucked in a sharp breath, forcing the emotion from her voice. "Let's start intubation," she ordered, her tone steady, controlled. Even though her heart was breaking, the medical team moved swiftly, the air thick with urgency. Eleanor had suffered extensive injuries. Multiple fractures, possible internal bleeding, and a severe head trauma. Every moment counted. Scarlett focused on the task in front of her, pushing aside the memories clawing at the edges of her mind. But it wasn't easy. Every time she glanced down at him, every time she saw his face, bruised and lifeless, the past came rushing back. The nights she had cried alone, the years of silence, the way he had looked at her in the hospital lobby just days ago, as if he were the one drowning in pain. And now it was her hands fighting to keep him alive. Fate was cruel, but Scarlett didn't believe in fate, she believed in choices. And this time, she was the one who had the power. The heart monitor screamed its warning, a frantic, erratic beeping that sent a jolt through the room. "He's going into cardiac arrest," a nurse shouted. "Adrenaline, let's revive him," Scarlett ordered, her voice sharp, urgent. They worked fast. Once, twice, 3 times, Scarlett pressed the defibrillator paddles against Eleanor's chest, electricity surging through his body. "Come on, Eleanor. Again. Come back. Again." But deep down she knew. His body was too broken. His injuries too severe. She knew. And yet, again. The team followed her command. One last desperate attempt. And then, the heart monitor flatlined. A long, haunting beep filled the room, cutting through the heavy silence like a knife. No pulse. No second chances. A doctor glanced at the clock, his voice heavy with finality. Time of death, 6:42 p.m. Scarlett's breath caught. Her hands trembled as she took a slow step back, her pulse thundering in her ears. This was it. Eleanor Willard was gone. Without a word, she turned and left the operating room. She pulled off her gloves as she walked, tossing them into a bin without looking. Her body moved on autopilot. But her mind was chaos. Later that night, when Scarlett finally walked through her front door, exhaustion weighed down every step, physically, emotionally. Completely drained, the house was quiet except for the soft hum of the rain still falling outside. And there, on the sofa, curled up in sleep, was Lily, her little body nestled against her teddy bear, her face peaceful, untouched by the storms that had raged that day. Scarlett felt something in her chest tighten. She had fought to protect her daughter from pain, from disappointment. And yet, tonight, she had lost something she never thought she would have to grieve. Her gaze drifted to her bag, the letter. Her fingers hesitated before reaching inside and pulling out the envelope. The edges were slightly crumpled, the ink of her name written in Eleanor Hayes' familiar handwriting. Her hands shook as she opened it. These were his last words, the final piece of him that remained. Watery eyes, Scarlett sat down, took a steadying breath, and began to read. Scarlett, if you're reading this, it means I'm gone. I told myself I'd leave quietly, without interfering in your life any more than I already have, but I couldn't go without saying this, without letting you know what's been buried inside me for so long. I never stopped thinking about you. About Lily. I know my return was unexpected, maybe even unwanted, but I needed to see you, to face the past I ran from. I destroyed what we had. I walked away from the only real thing I ever had. I abandoned what mattered most for a life I thought was the right choice. A life that turned out to be nothing at all. And now I see the truth. You weren't my mistake. You were my greatest loss. And Lily, the daughter I never had the courage to meet, has been the greatest absence in my life. There isn't a single day I don't regret it. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't expect anything at all. But if Violet ever asks about me, I hope you'll tell her the truth, that I loved her, even without knowing her, that if I could turn back time, I would have held onto you both with everything I had. Scarlett, you were my light, even when I was too blind to see it. Thank you for being the incredible woman you are, and for raising a daughter who, I have no doubt, is just as extraordinary as you, with all my regrets. Eleanor, tears streamed down Scarlett's face as she reached the end of the letter. Silent, unstoppable, the pain in her chest was almost unbearable, a weight pressing against her ribs, making it hard to breathe. Eleanor had been far from perfect, but his pain, his regret, had been real. And now, it was too late. Scarlett's gaze drifted to Lily, still curled up on the couch, lost in the innocence of sleep. She looked so peaceful, unaware of the man who had longed to know her, unaware of the love that had come too late. Scarlett felt something break inside her, a mixture of sorrow for what had been lost and gratitude for what she still had. Eleanor would never hold Lily's tiny hand in his. He would never hear her laughter, never watch her grow, never get the chance to be the father he had finally realized he wanted to be. But his love, however belated, however broken, had been real. And maybe that mattered in some small way. Scarlett leaned down, wrapping her arms around Lily, holding her close as fresh tears slipped down her cheeks. Her voice was barely a whisper as she pressed a kiss to her daughter's soft curls. He loved you, in his own way. My little one. Her voice broke, but now it's too late. And for the first time in years, Scarlett let herself grieve, for the man he had been, for the man he had never had the chance to become, and for the love that had come just a moment too late.